Okay, so now we'll get started in tying the Gray Drake emerger, Gray Drake Cripple. Starting my thread, I'll put my bobbin in my dominant hand. My tag goes in my non-dominant hand. Excuse me, I'm going to keep a tight connection here. Thread on top of the hook, bobbin on the outside, and I'm going to put down a thread base, but I'm only going to go about halfway because we're going to put the wing on first, and I'm going to come back toward the eye of the hook, let that hang down there, and I'll cut off my tag. So now elk hair. And people always ask me, how much elk hair do I use? On an elk hair caddis or a fly? A good answer, or I guess a decent answer would be, I use about the hook gap right here, the gap of the hook. I select hair about as much as right around, that's a little bit too much probably, right about the gap of the hook. So that is going to be pretty darn close. And remember, it doesn't have to be exact, but if you're about a hook gap, that's going to be a good amount of elk hair to use for your elk hair caddis or this fly. Now, one thing about elk hair and deer hair is that there is under fur. Some people call it duff, and it's like an insulating fur, and you can maybe see it's kind of fuzzy there in my fingers. And so we want to make sure we kind of flick that back and forth and get all that duff out of there. Some people will buy like a small mustache brush or comb to brush it out, but I find if I just kind of flick it back and forth a few times, all that duff will come out. So those are all clean. And the reason we do that is if you leave that duff in there, it'll absorb water and it'll sink your dry fly quicker than it would normally. So now we're going to use our hair stacker, and we're going to put the tips of the hair in the hair stacker, tips down, and I'm going to tap it a few times on the table. And what that'll do is that will even up all of the hairs. I'm going to pull this tool apart, and you can see that all those hairs are nice and, actually they're not that nice and uniform. We're going to stack those again real quick. Make it look nice. There we go, let's try that. Now we're cooking. So now they're all totally even and ready to go. So I'm going to grab these tips, I'm going to pull them out. And for this fly, our wing is going to hang out over the front of the hook. And for the wing, I want to have for the wing a little bit, about the length of the shank of the hook. Lay that in here. I'm going to give this thread a counterclockwise spin. And what that'll do for a right-handed fly tire, it will allow the thread to jump backward towards your fingers. And watch this. When I put a little bit of slack in this thread, it's going to lay right against my fingers, allowing me to come around and really capture that easily. And then I'm going to tie a couple nice tight wraps down to really secure that hair. And then I'm going to cut off these butts and then continue on down the hook all the way to the bend. I'm not going to worry too much about those little pieces of elk hair sticking up because they'll get covered. So now I'm at the bend of the hook. All right. So now I'm going to put on some tailing material, which is Antron yarn. And I have taken, for this particular fly, I'm going to cut a piece off of my card. That is too thick for what I want to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this in half. I'm going to break it in half. I'm going to take about half of this amount, kind of split it, oops, dropped it, kind of split it down the middle so I don't have quite as much heft at the back of that fly. So I've got my Antron yarn. I'm just going to square it up with my scissors and make all these even so they're easier to attach. And I'm going to give that thread again a counterclockwise spin for tying on tailing material. Let it spin for a little bit, and then that thread will lay right back against my fingers really nice and attach that right at the bend of the hook. I'm going to work my thread forward, catching those fibers as I go. All right, and then I'm going to cut this tail to length, which is about, a little bit better than the hook gap. Just like that. So there's my tail or my trailing shuck. So with this insect, what we're imitating here is when these mayflies are emerging out of the water. And this is actually imitating the exoskeleton that is being shed off of the insect as it emerges through the surface film of the water. All right, I'm going to tie on a biot now, but before I do that, I'm going to put a little bit of crazy glue on the shank of the hook. I'm going to kind of take a bunch off. I don't want too much. The reason I do this is because this feather, this biot, is a pretty fragile feather, and the crazy glue will just help it to be a little bit more of a durable fly. So here's my biots. I'm going to select one biot off of here, and I'm going to cut really close. There we go. And it might be kind of hard to see with the camera, but these biots have a convex side and they have a concave side. You definitely want to look at that feather carefully, and you want to try to have that convex side facing you if possible. So again, counterclockwise spin of the bobbin, because I'm attaching this little tiny material. I'm going to tie that in right here at the bend of the hook, and then I'm going to move my thread forward toward where the thorax will be, right about there. And here's where my rotating hackle pliers come in really handy for handling little tiny materials like this. Guys with big fingers, I'm going to clip that in there, and I'm going to come around with my hackle pliers. A wonderful little tool here. And I'm going to keep bringing this feather forward, this biot I should say. And by putting that convex side toward you, it gives it that really nice segmented look that you're seeing right now. I think I can get one more turn. I'm going to actually put the thread behind it and tie it off. You do need a pretty long biot to tie on these size 12 hooks, but that's okay. We got a good body on there. Now we're going to put on a thorax. I'm going to trim off that excess right here, and a couple more thread wraps to really secure it. Now dubbing, using beaver dubbing for the thorax. I'm going to take a little pinch of dubbing. Now one thing with dubbing, people sometimes when they do dubbing, they want to put the whole darn ball of dubbing on there. But when you do dubbing, what you want to do is just take little tiny bits of dubbing. I mean, just a little tiny bit. We're going to put it on there. Excuse me, my fingers are pretty dry. I'm going to put a little spit on my fingers. And you twist one way with your fingers when you put this on. You don't go back and forth, you twist one way. And the key is to put a very thin rope of dubbing on here. And if you're a beginning fly tyer, I will say that the natural animal hairs like rabbit, beaver, muskrat is way easier to learn with than the synthetics. That's just my opinion, but that should be big enough for the thorax. Okay, so nice tight rope of dubbing on my thread, and we're going to start that thorax right here. We're going to build up a thorax with this thread. There we go. All right. I don't like the way that last turn worked out. We're going to go forward a little bit more. There we go. There, that looks better. Now the hackle. So this is a trick that I learned from Scott Sanchez, who is one of my fly tying heroes. A lot of times when people attach a hackle, they will take and pull all the fibers off, making just down to the vein very smooth. Well, sometimes you'll pull that feather right through because there's nothing for it to hang on to. One thing that Scott taught me was instead of stripping it clean, rough those fibers out away from the center and take your scissors and cut right next to the vein, leaving, I don't know if this camera will pick it up, but leaving little tiny fibers on each side. And what's going to happen is that the thread is really going to lock those in. So we're going to tie this feather in here. And one thing about feathers is dry fly feathers, well, any feather has a concave side and a convex side. And usually the concave side is more brilliantly colored than the underside. So you want to try to put that concave side or more brilliantly colored side facing you. Now we're going to tie that in. And all those little pieces that I left on there, the thread is going to lock into that, and that feather's not going to fall out. Now we only need about 2 turns of this feather. We don't want to over hackle the fly. There's 1, and then there's 2. And I'm going to come behind and tie it off. When you tie off materials, you always bring your thread behind the feather. I'm going to come back behind with about 3 or 4 wraps. And then I can cut this feather off and save it for my next fly. All right. I'll put a couple more on there. So now I'm going to lift up this wing, pull it back, bring the thread up to the eye. I'm going to create a head and put about a dozen or so turns right there behind the eye of the hook. And one thing I'm going to do is, before I do my whip finish, I'm going to use my half hitch tool on my bodkin just to make a knot to hold it so it doesn't fall apart. Maybe 2. So that way nothing will slip, nothing will fall apart, and then I'm going to follow that up with my whip finish, and we're almost done. And there we have it. Move that wing a little bit forward, and that is the Gray Drake Cripple, also known as the Happy Meal. Wonderful fly in Montana. For the Gray Drake hatch, you can alter the materials to a smaller hook. For the pale morning dun, using maybe a yellowish biot with yellow dubbing and a cream hackle. You can alter it to the Gray Drake mayfly using a bigger hook, maybe a size 10, and then going with an olive colored biot and an olive colored dubbing. Maybe an olive hackle. So you can tie this pattern for most mayflies, and like I said, this is one of my go-to flies around here in the summer.